Welcome everybody, and today's video is all about back button focus. I'm going to show you how to use it, and I'm going to show you my personal preferences for focusing. Now, I'm predominantly a wildlife photographer, so this is going to be related to wildlife photography, but it's still going to be relevant in other styles of photography as well. I know a lot of you will already know what back button focus is, and some of you might already be using it, but if you're not too sure, perhaps you're a beginner just getting started, then first of all I'm going to explain what it actually is. So with the traditional style of focus, which everyone would have done years ago and some people still do, you'll use the shutter button both to focus on the subject and to take the picture. So you'd keep your finger half pressed on the shutter button, you'd focus on the bird or the animal, and then you'd depress the shutter completely to take the picture. Now with back button focus, what we're actually doing is separating the focus from the shutter button, so we're making them kind of independent of each other. So what we'll do is have a button on the back of the camera, and that's going to focus, and then the shutter button will fully depress to take the picture. Now one thing we have to do is to assign a button on the back of the camera. So we have to make sure that the camera knows that we want to use a button on the back to focus rather than the shutter button, and I'll come to that later in the video. There's one more thing we need to talk about before we get into it deeply, and that is the types of autofocus mode. So it's important to know the difference between these modes. Now you're probably going to have three. First of all, you should have autofocus AFS, which is like a single shot autofocus, also called one shot on Canon. Now this is where you focus once and it locks and you take the picture. You're also going to have AFC, which is AF continuous. Now this is your tracking autofocus for anything moving animals, birds in flight, and it's also called servo on the Canon. Now you may have as well an AFA, which is just autofocus auto. This is supposed to kind of decide between the two for itself, but nobody uses this. I don't, and I wouldn't trust it. Now the important thing is, for back button focus, you need to be on AFC, so you need to be on the autofocus continuous all the time. Okay, so let's get into how this actually works, back button focus. So once we've got our back button assigned, which I'll come to, and making sure you're in AFC, the tracking focus mode, what we're going to do is basically keep our thumb on the button on the back of the camera to engage the focus. So once your thumb is depressed on the back, if you keep that depressed, when you're following your subject, it's going to keep tracking and hopefully keep that subject in focus. So let's just say it's a running animal, for example. I'm just keeping my thumb depressed the whole time and tracking the animal, and it should be keeping it in focus. Now when we want to take a picture, we're simply going to just press the shutter button, and bear in mind as well with this setup that half pressing the shutter button won't do anything at all. So why should we use back button focus? You might be wondering, what is the benefit of it? Because you're having to use your thumb and your finger, so it seems like more work, right? There are a couple of advantages, and for the first, I'm going to use this little prop. It might seem a little bit silly, but it's just going to demonstrate really well. Now I could give him a name, but that just seems childish and silly, so we're going to call him Jeff. So I'm going to pop him on the end of here, and hopefully he doesn't fly away. Now the first benefit of back button focus is in terms of composition, so you can recompose the picture quite easily. I've had to come really far back because I've got the 500mm lens, so I have to get really far back from the penguin to do this. Now this is all about composing your picture, or I'd say more accurately recomposing, with using back button focus, and it can work really, really well. So the idea is that you can keep your focus engaged, and then you can take your thumb off to lock the focus and then recompose the shot how you'd like it. Let's just imagine that the penguin flew in. Penguins don't fly, do they? So let's imagine it's a different bird, it doesn't matter. It's flown in, and we have tracked it in with the back button focus, keeping our thumb engaged, and then it's landed. Now we want to recompose. So what I want to do is to get the bird to the left hand side of the frame, just as an example of a different composition for static portraits. Now if we've got our thumb on the back button and I'm focusing with the focus points in the center, the bird's currently in the center of the frame. Now if I was to move the camera to recompose, if I kept my thumb down, then it would focus onto the background because I'm keeping the focus engaged. So wherever I'm pointing the camera, the focus point, it's going to be focusing there on this tracking autofocus mode. So that's no good. So what we can do is to lock the focus, and it's really simple. So we can imagine that the bird flies in and it lands, and we're keeping that focus engaged with the back button, and now all we simply do is, I've got it in the center now, I'm just going to take my thumb off the back button focus. That's going to disengage, going to lock the focus in that one place. Then I'm just going to move the camera to slightly over to get the bird to one side, and then I'm going to press the shutter. When I recomposed and took the picture, I was keeping my thumb off the back button to lock the focus. There is another advantage, and that is that you can essentially change between a single shot autofocus and continuous autofocus very quickly. Now if you were to try and change those modes in camera, it might take longer, especially if you had to go into modes. You just don't really have time to do that, especially with wildlife photography. So this can work pretty well. Now, when I demonstrated with a penguin, we could kind of follow on from that example for what I mean here. If we were taking the static shot, maybe we did some recomposing, so we'd lock the focus. If the bird then decided to fly off again, as birds often do, then we'd want to very quickly go into tracking autofocus. And with the back button focus, it's just really quick. If the bird decides to fly, it's simply a case of pushing your thumb back in to engage the tracking autofocus and track it as it flies off. So it's a really quick way of going from a single shot autofocus to a tracking autofocus. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that you need to assign the back button to make it focus. You have to do that. Now it's unlikely that you won't be able to set up back button focus on your camera. You should be able to do that. But whether you've bought the camera brand new or maybe used, you don't necessarily know how the camera is set up and the focus operation. So you need to go in and make sure it's set up for back button focus. Now every camera is going to be slightly different, but I'm going to show you on my Canon 1DX how I'd set it up for back button focus. Now you'll probably find it's something like custom controls or custom functions. So if I go into this on my camera, here we have now all these different buttons on the camera, and we can assign their operation to a certain extent. So here for example I've got the shutter button, and here I've got the AF on button, which is this button right here. Now if I go into this, I can decide what I want it to do. So at the moment it says AF off. That would actually stop the autofocus. So if I go over to here, it says metering and AF start. That is now going to start the focus. It's also going to do the metering, but that is now basically going to focus. That has been assigned the focus operation. Select that, and now this here will do the focus on my camera. Just one little tip here, because I do think it's important. If we have our AF on button assigned to focus, just check the shutter button and make sure that the shutter button isn't assigned to focus as well. So just, if I go in there, see at the moment it still says it will do the AF start focusing, so make sure it's switched to something else. So on mine for example, I guess I could just put metering start and it would work okay, but just make sure that that shutter button isn't also assigned to the focus, else you might get some confliction. Most people do assign the back button focus to the AF on button, and it tends to be a bit bigger as well, I think, most times. If you can't see an AF on button, then look for either auto exposure lock or auto focus lock, and you should hopefully be able to assign one of those. So what do I personally do? Well, actually myself, I don't use back button focus. Despite showing you how to use it and the advantages, which there certainly are, I don't use it myself, and there's a few reasons for that. So I did give it a try, and I think you should give it a proper try, maybe for a couple of weeks if it's new to you. I probably tried it for about a week and I just didn't get on. It wasn't for me. Now I just found it felt just really awkward to me. It felt unnatural, and having to get your finger and your thumb around. I think on the bigger cameras it can be a bit more difficult to do that. Might depend on the size of your hands as well. But I also felt like I was having to think about two different things. I was having to think about the finger and the thumb, kind of doing two different things, and I just didn't like the feel of it at all. It didn't feel quite as intuitive to me either. So what I do is I use the old style traditional way of focusing with the shutter button half pressed. So if I was photographing a bird in flight, I'd be tracking the bird with the shutter button half pressed on servo focus mode, and then I'd fully depress the shutter to take pictures when I wanted to, and I could do that the whole time, just keep firing off if I wanted to shoot like that, and that works absolutely fine for me for tracking subjects. Now, what do I do if I want to recompose, like the demonstration earlier for a static portrait? I want to recompose the shot. How do I do that? Well, I actually do the exact opposite of back button focus. So I've set up my AF on button to basically be an AF off button. So instead of engaging the focus, it disengages the focus. So what I would do, again, tracking a bird in flight, half pressing to focus, and then it lands. And let's say that I want to recompose with the bird slightly to one side. All I do simply, I've completely forgotten. There's a lot of material in this video. So what I'll do is half press, the bird's landed, I'm on tracking autofocus all the time still, and then I'll actually press my AF on button on the back to lock the focus. So I'm keeping both my finger on the shutter button and my thumb on the back button to lock it, and then I can recompose anywhere I want. So I'll recompose to the side and fire my shot. So as long as I keep my thumb pressed in, I'm locking the focus. So I'm basically doing the opposite of back button focus, but still managing to lock and recompose. But there is another reason as well, which I thought about, which seems sensible to me, and that is if you're having to use your thumb and finger together, it seems to me it's better to have more work to do in an easier situation and less work to do in a more difficult situation. So for me, that works. If I was tracking a running animal really fast or a bird in flight, just using the shutter button is less to think about. I'm just using one button to focus and to fire, let the camera do the work, because it's a more difficult situation. If an animal, for example, stops, I've got more time for the static shots, which means I've got more time. I can use my thumb as well to lock the focus and recompose, which I find a bit more difficult. The one advantage that I might miss is the switching from an autofocus single to autofocus continuous, which is really, really useful. But what I actually find on my camera is that I can literally just press one button and then a dial, and I can switch between AFS and AFC if I needed to, and I know my camera so well that I can actually just do that without even looking. I don't even have to look at the camera, so it's still pretty fast, but that's potentially the only real downside to the way I work. So do you have to use back button focus? You don't have to. If it works for you, use it. If it doesn't, don't use it. Don't let anyone tell you you have to use back button focus. You'll see some people saying it's an absolute must, it's a no-brainer, etc. I don't agree with that at all. I think the way I do it, it works absolutely fine. It'll work for some other people as well. Whatever feels comfortable, you need to use. There's no point trying to use something that feels uncomfortable, that you don't enjoy, just because someone's told you to use it. So if you haven't used back button focus, I would definitely urge you to try it out. You might find you like it. If you do, stick with it. You might find that you really, really don't like it at all, like myself, and then you can just stick with the old style of focusing. If you do that, try and have some kind of system like I do to allow you to lock the focus. I think that's really important, and there's even other options in there, like you might be able to set up buttons to switch between a one-shot focus and a continuous focus, for example, just at the touch of the button. That might be useful too. Please let me know in the comments box. I'd be really interested to know what my viewers and subscribers out there do. Do you use back button focus? Why do you use it? How do you use it? If you don't, do you have something else set up to make life easier for yourself to get the best results? Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.